Shakespeare wrote famously, "Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven upon the face." It's one of the reasons why we need God's mercies to be new every morning, because every day is racked with trouble in one way, shape, or form. We are broken people living in a broken world with other broken people. There is nothing more certain than that you will suffer. It's inevitable. And when we do suffer, the first thing that most of us wrestle with is why? Why me? Why now? Why him? Why her? Why this? Why that? Why, God? Why? That's very natural for us to ask why when we are experiencing pain, when we are suffering. And when it comes specifically to God and our pain, we wrestle with how God can be totally good and totally in control. Now, the Bible makes it clear that God is both of those things all the time. He's totally good and he's totally in control. But when we look at the world around us and when we look at our own lives, we struggle to come to terms with the fact that God is both totally good and totally in control. Because if he's totally in control, then he must not be totally good. And if he's totally good, then he must not be in total control. He can't be both. Just look around at the world. Well, this emotional dilemma, wrestling with how God can be both good and in total control, this emotional dilemma reveals that we assume suffering is ultimately bad. Because of the pain of it, we assume, understandably, that suffering is ultimately bad, that pain is ultimately useless. And because we conclude that pain is ultimately useless and that suffering is ultimately bad, we conclude that God must not be either totally in control or totally good. We read Job's story and we think to ourselves, what kind of God is this? Job is this good guy and he's minding his own business, and in some unseen place the devil shows up and challenges God. And God uses Job to prove a point twice. This just sounds so heartless. But it only sounds like God is careless and heartless and callous in these circumstances if we assume that the suffering Job is about to experience is ultimately bad for him. But what if what comes out of Job's suffering proves to be ultimately good for him? God uses the bad stuff as his platform to show us more of himself. This is what he's getting ready to do in this story. He's getting ready to show Job and Job's friends and the devil himself attributes of his that would have otherwise gone unseen. There is something about pain, loss, suffering, catastrophe that enlarges us and that helps us to see God in brand new, bright, and liberating ways. Now, knowing all of this doesn't take away the pain. I'm not for 1 second suggesting that when you are in the crucible of ache, you should have a smile on your face and go, well, God's going to do something good with it, so I'm okay. That's not a realistic, honest reaction to suffering and catastrophe. We don't find that in the Bible. We never see God sort of having this stiff upper lip posture toward those of us who suffer. It just doesn't. The Psalms are filled with prayers and petitions from the psalmist to God going, why? Crying, lamenting, complaining, arguing, weeping, grieving, all of those things that God allows, gives us the space to express. So knowing this doesn't take away the pain. But the last thing we want to do when we are in the crucible of ache is to discard or dismiss God's sovereignty. Because God's sovereignty, his all-in-controlness, is a shock absorber when it comes to pain. Shock absorbers, as you know, they don't take away the bump altogether, but they do absorb the bump to the degree that the car doesn't fall apart. It absorbs the shock. One poet put it this way: when speaking about how necessary and how comforting the sovereignty of God is when we're in pain, and how tempting it is to dismiss it, to discard it, to conclude that God's not in control. And he puts it this way: pain and loss are bitter providences. Who has lived long in this world of woe without weeping, sometimes until the head throbs and there are no more tears to lubricate the convulsing of our amputated love? But oh, the folly of trying to lighten the ship of suffering by throwing God's sovereignty overboard. The very thing the tilting ship needs in the storm is the ballast of God's good governance, not the unburdening of deep and precious truth. What makes the crush of calamity sufferable is not that God shares our shock, but that his bitter providences are laden with the bounty of love. It is the sovereignty of God that becomes a pillow that we can rest our weary, suffering heads on when we're experiencing calamity and loss. It's the ability to go, God, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know why you're doing it. I don't like it. But I find great comfort in knowing that you are good and you are in complete control, and that whatever's happening behind the scenes that I'm not privy to see is something that is ultimately good. Ultimately, he's making all things new.